Bueno, soy Julian Bonder, soy arquitecto y profesor de arquitectura, graduado de Buenos Aires y enseño y vivo en Cambridge, en Massachusetts, en Estados Unidos. Part of what I've been working on for the last few years is to try to find ways to connect space and memory, or actually to try to understand the relation between space and memory. And that was centered on issues of both storytelling and connections between traumatic histories and public spaces. So that's part of what I've been doing, both teaching and practicing architecture as well. I began this process looking at the history of the Holocaust and Holocaust memory. I was interested in understanding the relation between places in Europe where the history happened and how people remember in space. How stories can be told and things are actually almost like without a chance of being told. So I asked myself, why happens that we look at space and we connect space and memory. So that's how it started. I did projects both in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and in the United States, and also in Europe, various kinds of projects. So I started with that kind of almost like a research interest on space and memory, dealing with history and Holocaust memory. Then I started, I was invited to do a project for a Civil War memorial in Boston. And I asked myself, what do I know about the Civil War? I had no idea. So I started researching the question of Civil War and memory. And that led to other kinds of projects and other kinds of relations, looking at the question of slavery and the reasons for the war. And then I began a process with a partner, a design partner, artist Christophe Wodichko, and who were commissioned to do a project in France, which is a memorial to the abolition of slavery, Mémorial de l'abolition de l'esclavage, Nantes. And that basically is a process that took a long time, because it was a kind of a public project. It's a very large project, so we began that process in 2003, and the public space opened in 2012 to the public. And so that was part of the process in terms of some projects. Other projects that I worked on in the United States, I did the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. I did a project for the Buenos Aires Holocaust Museum. I had other projects dealing with the history of September 11 in the United States. But I'm interested in looking at these projects, even though some of them are memorials, to think about not so much as memorial as an object, but actually I'm interested in the word memory. I understand memory as a verb, memory as action, memory as not as an object, but something that is connected to what we do in the present. So I'm not interested in the notion of commemoration or contemplation of the past, but actually thinking that the past helps us understand our present. So that's how this becomes almost like a living condition. That's part of what I've been doing. I think it is because, in a certain way, when we're talking about public space, we're looking at the question of democracy. Always. The notion of public and space are connected to democracy, in our societies. And many societies, part of the difficulties is to understand democracy as an ongoing process, an ongoing project. The project for democracy is never ending. And democracy is based on uncertainty. It's not just something that is fixed. So for us, or for me, basically, there is a very deep connection between democratic values and public space. That is to say, democracy is legitimized through speech in public. And it's always a question of who gets to speak. We know that history or public spaces or monuments usually are related to the history of victors. I'm interested in another history, which is the history of those who do not have a voice in public space. So how do we invite that to be with us? And how do we allow, let's say, in a good sense, those histories to interrupt our present? How do we not only accept the fact that others are the key to understand ourselves in democracy, who are these others who sometimes we don't know or we don't want to see. So who are those who really make democracy possible? Democracy is always based on others, and that connects space, memory, and ethics in a very powerful way. Ethics is based on a relation with the other, and at some level, if we don't understand that other as even more important than ourselves, then perhaps we're not paying attention to the real deep meaning of democratic life. So we'd like to suggest, or would like to understand that what we try to do in space is to create instruments, that relate to democratic values and democratic culture. It's interesting to think that, when we made proposal, we always insisted that the project should not be just a commemoration of the past of the city of Nantes, which was the capital of French slave trade. It was not just the idea of looking at the past, it was thinking about the present. The project is based on inviting people, especially young generations as well, to reflect on conditions of the present today. For example, what about trafficking, human traffic today? That's part of the kind of quest for this project. The second part is to understand that the city itself, which, its economy grew tremendously through the slave trade and through transportation, but also to sugar. Nantes basically controlled most of French Caribbean colonies. So part of the triangular trade, was part of the story of Nantes. But the idea here was that we discovered when we made a proposal to inhabit a space that nobody has ever seen, which is underground, was the embankment of the ports of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, and was constructed, as, like many places in Europe, as residues, one on top of the other. So we found that space, and we decided to propose that this space becomes adapted and transformed to become the memorial. It's a very long space. The memorial is 400 meters long. It's all the coast of the Loire River in the center of the city. So there are two political issues here. One is that public space is always political, in terms of society and in terms of, who determines what to do in public space. So the fact that Nantes accepted the proposal and actually welcomed the idea that we will transform 400 meters of the center of the city into a memory of its own history was quite strong. There was a lot of resistance to that, from groups that didn't want to be somehow seen as Nantes a guilty city. But basically, what we said is this is not about guilt. It's about sort of recognition of a story, and it's about creating something unique in Europe. And that's how the mayor, who then became French Prime Minister, Jean-Marc Ayrault, embraced the project. And that's how it became possible to do it. In terms of its construction, it's very complex because it's an underground space that floods, it's on the waterfront. So basically we had to construct a dam underground, like a couvelage, this is called in French, to protect it from the 4-meter daily tides of the Loire River. So there's construction complexities, there's ideas about space, but there's something else that happens when it opened. The project became embraced by the city, by all citizens, to the point in which everybody that goes visits family members to Nantes, they bring them to the memorial. So there's so far, they say that there's an average of about 600 people every day going into the memorial, and so far it's about 700,000 people that visited the memorial and got into kind of a concept of slowing down the pace and thinking about memory in its own heart. We're trying to create a space for memory to be understood from within, ourselves, to connect to others in conversation. It's a quiet space. It's not a space of exaltation. It's not a space of oppression. It's not a place that tries to represent horror, or to represent victims. It's a space that tries to give voice to people who fought against slavery, to abolish slavery, not only in the past, but in the present. There's a large glass wall that comes from underground and emerges to the city, that is about 100 meters long, and that includes texts. It's only texts. And there's about texts that come from 5 continents and 5 centuries of people fighting against slavery. So you have voices like Ouida Equiano, Toussaint Louverture, but you also have voices like Toni Morrison or Martin Luther King or Bob Marley, that are inscribed in this glass wall. And people take a long time. This is to me one of the most interesting learning experiences, is that people walk the space and take a long time to think about it. I think there are many examples of very interesting work. There's a big dilemma here. The representation of the past, which is always a projection of the present onto the past, is always problematic. Ethically is problematic because, at some level, historiography basically, at some level, projects meaning over the past from the present. So for me, there's always an issue which, historical museums, which I love to see, but there's an issue that is to think that the more you tell the story, or the more things you have about the story, the more people will learn about it. And there's something about the question of learning, in terms of pedagogic enterprises, that is not so clear, because we're dealing with traumatic histories, which is, a traumatic history is a history that cannot be mastered, and that cannot be taught in traditional pedagogic lines, meaning narration, chronology, or things of that sort. So, and historic museums always have an issue, which is that public understands history through museums or books, but they are a slice of history, a portion of history that has been told. So the narrator, the historian, or the curator, in their best heart, have ideas about how to represent the past. This is very valuable. But many historical museums think that every single wall that they have needs to be filled with stuff. So the more wall you have, the more things you can show, the more people will learn. I value empty space because it allows for reflection. It's not so much the bombardment of images or material that will allow us to understand history, but sometimes leave empty space for that to happen. And in our experience in Nantes, which is not a historical museum, one of the values is that the city accepted that there will be almost nothing there. This is an interesting thing. Some other curator of historical museums would have said, okay, we have 100 meters of wall, let's put as much material as we can. And there's always a dilemma, which is, as people understand history through a museum, for example, they don't realize that that's only a portion of what they learn, a portion of what happened. So I'm interested on this condition, but I'm also interested in the condition of specificity of sites. How a site can help us tell a story. Sites of memory, like we talked, both in Barcelona or in Belarus or in very different kinds of places. There are stories that have to be told that connect a place to people. And I'm very interested in that. That's why all our projects are very site-specific, derived from what we read on the site. Almost like ground. I always say that the ground has stories embedded that needs to be told. And the ground itself that we walk is a living archive. It's a living archive of memories. So that's part of what we try to do. And there are examples of very good museums, kind of all over the world. But there's also examples of this issue of surfeit of memory, an excess of memory. So we have to find a way to quiet down, to create parentheses, as you said, Benjamin, to interrupt history, not to fill our minds with kind of facts, but actually interrupt our present. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm interested in how art can contribute to our thinking about this. To me, that's a key question. Art in public space. How can we contribute as architects, artists, historians to a kind of a broad dialogue about what is the meaning of democracy, what is the meaning of the past, And one thing that, I don't know, perhaps I'm going too long, but one thing that I always try to do is to consider our work as shedding light over the past. Almost like think of a lamp, that projects like a circle over the past. You don't see the totality, you just see what you're illuminating. But the moment you illuminate something, that thing that you illuminate is actually shedding light on you, which means that you become responsible for what you look, what you see. And you cannot shy away, you cannot block your eyes once you started seeing that. But you have to take responsibility, not to project meaning over the past, but to let the past interrupt your present with different kind of meaning. So for example, when we talk about genocide, I'm not just interested on the history of the Holocaust or Rwanda, I'm interested on how that history makes us think about our present. Is this thing continuing today or slavery? Yes, we can talk about transatlantic slavery, trans-Saharan slavery and all things, but are we discussing really what is happening today with women being trafficked? You know, so many women every day, more than half a million women every year are trafficked just for purpose of sex slavery, you know, in the world. So how are we dealing with that? You know, with child labor, how are we dealing with that? So if these projects can contribute in some way, is to make us more aware, you know, of both our fragility, but also our capacity to change the world. And this is what I hope we can do. It's a big challenge, because let's say, at many levels, we all come to this subject that is very dear to all of us, you know, who participate on this kind of public debates and democracy, because we're interested in this, because our own personal histories, for many reasons we want to participate on that. But at some level we're also doing it at what I call safe distance, you know, safe distance. So we need to understand that that kind of condition of safe distance allows us to both engage more, take more risks, you know, to help society become better. You know, at the end of the day, public space can help us do that. Public spaces and democratic life can do that. So I think there are very important projects that still need to be done, because again, the democratic project, as you clearly know, is not finished. It's in process. It's always ongoing. You know, so for me, the big challenge for us as kind of academics, as architects, as artists, as filmmakers, as storytellers, is to actually become more engaged with the public and understand our position as public intellectuals. You know, concerned members of society, you know, that can affect the public in ways, very, very respectful ways, you know, to conceive and to discuss with others. And also to engage in conversation with people who think different. Because, you know, if, as they say, you know, we're always talking to people who think similar to us, then what's the purpose, right?
Yeah.
So for me, that's an issue.
What about politics?
Politics is at the heart of all this. Politics and public space are totally connected.
Yeah.
You know, the polis is politics. You know, the urban life is connected to politics. And politics is always connected to the idea of the agora. But the agora, I think, more as an agon of memory, a place where we debate, not to try to find consensus, perhaps as Habermas would try to suggest the public sphere, but actually to understand that dissensus and debate are the key for democratic life, for the ongoing process. The kind of public space as textured, as not just smooth, you know, let's be all friends. It's not the point. The point is to have, you know, engaged conversations with others and try to find not only common ground, but actually find that, yes, we can be different, but we can coexist and we can embrace difference. You know, to me, that's the most important thing, you know, to try to keep working at it.
Mm-hmm. Well, just the last question. Argentine American person, you can see something, you can find differences between this memory and public memory issues between this continent and the other, and Europe, dealing with the European Observatory also.
Yeah, I mean, to me this is a very interesting thing, because just a little...
Which thing? You have to repeat, because my questions are not in the...
Okay. So the question of the kind of observing memories and the European Observatory is a fantastic, you know, enterprise, you know, as an endeavor, as an idea. I mean, I come from it from various points of view, but one of them is that my family comes from Europe. My mother was born in Berlin, and they barely escaped the Holocaust. My mother was born in 36, and they spent a year and a half hiding until they were able to have a visa to go to South America. In 38, they left from Marseille. So, you know, my father comes from a Ukrainian family. So, like many people in South America and the United States, people come from Europe. So for me, there's almost like a deep connection. For me, it's kind of, there's something of similar nature, but there's something very different in terms of the kind of vibrancy, you know, of the new world, let's say, which is very different than, you know, the stones that we find here. But when I come to Europe, I feel at home at some level. I've never lived here, but I feel at home. Perhaps it's my ancestors. But I also feel, what happened here? I also ask my question, what happened here? Why so much hatred among people, you know? And again, it's not to understand that what I do comes from only the tradition of my family being partly killed. It's not just an autobiographic cleansing that I'm trying to do here at all. And it's not that my work is legitimate because of what happened in my family. I studied under dictatorship, friends of mine were disappeared. All of that marks me as a person, but actually what it does is makes me more responsible for what I can do for others in public space. So I see that as an opportunity to help in conversations, to help with projects, to help, you know, institutions, to help institutions of memory in Europe and in America to try to see how can we make very quiet interventions in public space or in museums that are conducive to this conversation. So for me, Europe and the observatory, going back, is something that I think is a fantastic opportunity to begin connecting places that are disconnected, you know, that have this underlying history, you know, but underlying history that should change the present. If it only becomes kind of just looking at the past, is not the intention, then, you know, the kind of, but I think the value of this is to think about how the past will change our present, will help us transform our present. And I think the observatory has a great potential for that.